You've heard me talk about consciousness and energy and so many similar topics on this channel all of the time. And these things are great in theory. It's great to have the information when it comes to raising your consciousness and all these different things. But what are some things we can actually do that you can go away from this video or take away from this video that will actually help you raise your consciousness quickly? Now, before we move on, I want to mention that what we're talking about is consciousness as rated on the Hawking scale of consciousness. This is kind of one of the best templates we have to understand the different levels. They're usually associated with different emotions like fear, guilt, shame, love, peace, joy, these kinds of things. So if you're not familiar with that scale, you can look it up and you can follow along here in the video. If you are familiar with that scale, then you're ready to go as far as this video is concerned. But how can you start to raise your consciousness quickly? Because it's actually quite a myth that it takes a long time. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean it also will take a short amount of time. Everyone is going to be different. You know, if you've been living your life in low consciousness for most of the time, it's probably going to take you a bit longer than someone who has been living in a higher level of consciousness for most of their life. So I'm actually going to give you 7 ideas and also practices that are going to help you to do this. Some of these are going to help you understand consciousness a little more clearly so you know, one, where you are on the scale, although it's not so important, but I'll go over that as well, but also how you can raise up the scale quite quickly and some other things to keep in mind that are just going to help you on this journey. Now, I will say one thing. I want to offer this for you. For those of you who are ready to do this as quickly as possible, to do it with guidance, and you want to work with us, you can check out my free EMF training down below, linked in the description. In this training, I'm going to go over our EMF program, but also give you some of the ideas and lessons behind the EMF program, why it works, what we help people do to give you a better idea of what's going on, so you know, again, what we're actually doing and that it actually works. And again, it is one of the most efficient things I've ever come across to raising your consciousness and living in higher levels of consciousness and then reaping the benefits of being there. So if you're interested in working with us, you're interested in doing this in the fastest way possible, but efficient way possible too, with experts guiding you through, then you can check that down below, look at the free training and check out more of that page. Now, without further ado, again, I said I had 7 things for you. So let's move into number 1. And these things are going to help you to understand this more and start applying this more in your life. Now, number 1 is essential, and I see so many people not doing this, and if you don't do this one thing, you're just going to really not progress much at all on this scale and really struggle, and it's bringing in humility and honesty. And I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to who believe they're at one level on the scale of consciousness, and it's clear that they are not. And this is because of the lack of humility first and foremost, and honesty, and this is because a lot of times their ego has been inflated to such a point that they don't even realize that it is their ego. For example, I've had people who have told me they're in what's called ASME, or peace and enlightenment, and that's where they're living, when it's quite clear they're in things like pride much more. And there's a huge discrepancy between those levels. I'll even have it on screen. Pride is at 175, enlightenment is at 700, peace is at 600, and these are massive differences because this is a logarithmic scale, which means there's actually a huge difference between one level. So 200 and 201 is a massive increase in energy, for example. And I've met so many people who are so stuck in pride that their ego has convinced them that they're not in pride, and in fact, they're higher up this scale. And so it's so crucial to be honest and have humility on this journey. And humility is one of the gateway emotions, one of the gateway things that will help you rise in consciousness. There are just certain levels you will not reach without humility. Now, when I say humility, I don't mean like selling yourself short. That's not what I'm talking about. You can say, I'm freaking awesome, without being someone who's not being humble, right? You know, a lot of people confuse humility with like this idea of making yourself small. But one thing I will definitely mention that the ego loves to do is comparison. So for example, oh, you know what? I'm in ASME and this person's not. And essentially your ego saying, I'm better than this person. I'm further along. That is when you throw humility out the window. Now, the next thing is self-honesty. And you'd be amazed how many people are not honest with themselves, right? And when you're not honest with yourself, you don't know where the gaps are. You don't know where you need to grow. You don't know what it is you need to work on in order to get to that next place in your life. And so many people are not honest with themselves because they're actually lower on the scale than they realize. And so bringing humility and honesty into this this area, into this game, is what's going to help you grow the most. And you can actually go fast up the scale when you bring in both of these things, because then you're honest about where you're at. So if you're in pride, you go, you know what, I need to be honest, I'm in pride. What's happened here? How is this showing up? And then you can catch yourself when you're doing it, which will help you so much as well. And then the humility to also be completely okay with wherever you're at, but we'll get into that. So the first thing is honesty and humility. People always sway to guessing that they're higher up the scale than they are at. And I'll give you some indicators to know whether you are or you're not, but so many people believe they are. And just to put this in context, when Hawkins, before he died, he calibrated how many people on the planet when he died are in ASME or above 700. It was 7 people on the planet in total, right? So that just give you an idea of how rare it is to hit these higher levels of consciousness and live in places like enlightenment. Peace would also have been only a handful of people as well. And I'm going to go over later in this video, it's not better or worse to be in any of these places, but I just use that as a contrast frame, because if you think you're one of those 7 people, I just have news for you. I don't think anyone watching this right now is. It's not better or worse, but again, we have to bring in this self-honesty and humility. Now, number 2 is understanding the difference between living and visiting. And this is a huge concept when it comes to consciousness, and something in our EMF program that we really teach our students, because when they understand this, so much begins to change for them. And this is what allows you to bring in more honesty and humility. You see, some people experience love at some point. Some people experience peace, or even having a moment of enlightenment and then believe, oh, that's where I'm resonating. Right? But that's like someone going to the gym once a year and thinking they're fit. You understand what I'm saying? There's a difference between visiting a certain level of consciousness and what your set point is. So if you ever heard of the idea of a vibrational set point, that's the same thing as where you're living. So your vibrational set point will be at a certain place. This is where you're at consistently. You might waver up and down from that place. You might every now and then go way up here or go way down here. But for the most part, you're going to come back to this spot. Right? And so there's a huge difference between living somewhere and visiting somewhere. And one of the goals we have for our EMF students, and what happens for them, is we get them to live in higher conscious places and only visit lower places, because you have to have the contrast. Where most people have the opposite. They live in lower consciousness and only visit higher consciousness from time to time. And so what we help people do is reverse that, so they're living in places like peace, love, joy, acceptance, willingness, and so on. And they only ever visit the other places, and they know what to do when they're in those places. But most people, again, they're living in low consciousness, in fear, in guilt, in shame, in pride, and anger, and they only ever visit the other states. And again, this is just for awareness sake, that just because you had a moment of enlightenment or a moment of love doesn't mean you're living in those places. And again, it's not to be dismayed by that. It's just so you know, okay, not to get into your ego and be like, I'm in this, I'm in 500, I'm in 600, and et cetera, when in reality, all that's going to do is hold you back from actually climbing the scale with humility, with honesty, to a point where your vibrational set point is getting higher and higher naturally. And I want to mention this before moving on, because it's important, because again, this is why our ego gets involved. It is not better or worse where you are on the scale. Someone who's in pride is not better or worse than someone who's in enlightenment. That's just where you are in your journey. And the moment you can accept and have the humility to say, this is where I'm at and that's perfect, that is when you get the springboard to start moving upwards. Because until you accept and have willingness to move from wherever you're at, you're not going to grow. In fact, when you can truly accept where you're at, you start launching your consciousness, because acceptance, I believe, is at 310. Willingness at 350. Sometimes I mix those up. But it goes way up when you finally have acceptance of where you are at. That is the gateway to raising your consciousness. But when people think they're higher than they are, when people bring in a level of ego, a level of I'm going to prove that I'm the best, comparison, all that kind of stuff, that's when they keep themselves firmly rooted where they are at. And just one more analogy to give you, it's not better or worse, again, in the same way that a first grader is not better or worse than a sixth grader. Would you say to a first grader, you're not as valuable, and in fact, you're terrible because you're not a sixth grader? No, because the first grader's in first grade, because it needs to be in first grade to get the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. But it's not better or worse in the same way that an acorn is not better or worse than the oak tree. They're both important parts of the process, and no part of the process is more important than the other. You cannot have one without the other. And so your ego will like to think it would be much better if I was in 500, so let's latch ourselves onto that idea instead of being honest about where we're at, so we can actually have room to grow. right? So I just want to throw that in there. It's not better or worse, whatever level you find yourself at. It's just about being honest about what you're at, accepting that and loving that, and then moving from there. But if you don't accept where you're at, or you let your ego come in and say, hey, 6th grade's better than 1st, well, you'll never accept wherever you're at and never actually give yourself that springboard to grow. Number 3 is honor your inner world. This is where the higher levels of consciousness exist. The outer world follows your inner. If you find yourself getting worked up and attached to the outer world all the time, it's usually an indicator of living in a slightly lower level of consciousness. As you start raising your consciousness, one of the things our students in EMF start to notice is even if chaos is going on in their life, they're not that bothered by it and they don't get hooked into it, and it always works out in the end. They find that even when things are unknown, they trust the universe, they root themselves in their knowingness, in their energies, in their love, in that energy that they're now in, and things actually work out because when you're in higher levels of consciousness, you actually invite more order and coherence into your life. And so even if chaos is happening, oh, it's going to smooth out. I don't need to get worried about it. I don't need to get this and that. And so our students are amazing at doing that because we help them through this process, because we help them to honor their inner world with some of the best practices and awarenesses and insights and kind of processes that help them to get there. But you have to enter the inner world more, because understand that the inner world is the more real world. And that might be beyond some of your level of understanding right now. Some of you might understand that. But the outer comes from the inner. So the more you maintain your inner world, you do the inner work, the more this will begin to smooth out, the more you will raise your consciousness. But if you're getting hooked into everything in the external, it's going to lower it, usually most of the time. Number 4 is learn to let go and lower the importance. I've gone over letting go so much on this channel. In fact, I have a full video on shadow work that I can give you. I'll link that down below. And these are like ultimate letting go techniques. And this is why so many people stay rooted in the lower levels of consciousness, because they're holding on to lower level energies like shame and guilt in their bodies. The way I like to describe it, it's like they are holding on to these energetic anchors and you're suspended in water and the anchors are pulling you down. And so no matter what you do, you always have this anchor attached to you, so you can try and swim up, you can struggle, you can do whatever, but it's always going to cause your vibrational set point to come down because you have this anchor. So instead of trying to swim up, instead of trying to add more things, we should focus on removing the anchor, which by doing so will cause you to naturally begin to float up. And so letting go and lowering the importance, finding the playfulness in life. And again, this is something that comes a bit later. As you start letting go, the freedom starts showing up and everything else. But when you start letting go, you start naturally rising up to the surface. You start removing those energetic anchors that you may have had at your ankles since you were a kid, because you picked up things from people who also had a lot of energetic anchors, and they shared them with you. Again, that's just kind of nature of how this sometimes happens. So when you remove those, you do the letting go work, which is a part of the inner work, you start to naturally begin to rise. And it's, again, something we have our students do at a very profound level with some of the best tools you can possibly have, because we know the importance of it. And I forget, I think it's module 2, or actually module 4, we have them do that. And the amount of releases that happen in that module, and the amount of things people realize and go, oh my God, I didn't know it was just this thing I was holding on to that's helped me move so far up, is astounding. Because again, once you release the energetic anchors, what happens? You naturally start to float up. You can look at it, I've also heard this analogy, if you're in a hot air balloon and you're kind of staying there, you have to release the sandbags and you start to naturally float up. Number 5 is learn how to reprogram your subconscious and remove limiting beliefs. Now, I found that people who identify as kind of more spiritual, they like to avoid this one because it sounds a little more technical. It sounds a little non-spiritual, like, oh, my mind, I don't want to reprogram my mind. Well, understand that the full beingness of us is mind, body, and spirit. Now, the soul, the spirit, is super important, but do you think a fully integrated soul would ignore the other two, like the physical and the mind? It's not about ignoring these things, it's about just knowing in what order they go. Everything emanates from the inner world, but you still have a body, you still have a mind, and these things serve as amazing tools and are not, in my eyes, to be neglected. That's why when you start raising your consciousness, guess what? You actually become more health-oriented. Guess what? You actually care more about the thoughts that are coming into your mind, and you become more strict about what is allowed and what isn't, right? Because as you raise your consciousness, these things naturally come to you that you want to do, because that just helps you in your beingness more. These things are not redundant, right? So we don't want to neglect these things. And in fact, if you neglect your subconscious mind, you are going to be running around based on someone else's program. And so one of the best things that I recommend for people to do is to learn how to reprogram their subconscious mind. I know I keep going on about it, but in the EMF program, we help people do this because it's so crucial. If we don't take those limiting beliefs out, if we don't help them shift into a new identity, if we don't help them reprogram the thing that's literally running their life on autopilot, then they will never be able to easily move up the scale. They will not be easily doing the inner work fully. They will not be easily having thoughts they want to come in, and beliefs they want to come up. So it's so crucial. Now, I will give you a deep dive video that I've created. I will link that down below, and also at the end of the video, I'll give you a way to go to that video. Essentially, it's a full deep dive on how to reprogram your subconscious mind. But this part is so crucial. I really wouldn't skip it because you are not exempt from the subconscious mind, even if you don't want to look at it. You know, in the same way, if people don't want to look at these levels of consciousness and energy, you don't have to look at it, but the truth is the truth, and it doesn't care whether you believe in it or not, or whether you justify it or not. It just keeps standing there and shining and working its magic. And so we might as well learn the rules to the game, to all of the game, so that we can operate better in the game. So with your subconscious mind, if you reprogram it, it's going to serve you, and in the ways that you actually want it to serve you. If you don't, well, it's going to be someone else's agenda you're going to be playing out. Number 6 is actually one of my favorite sayings, and I'm trying to remember who it comes from. I think it might be Neville Goddard, but it might be someone else that was from his era. And essentially what it is to give more faith to the vision. And essentially what this means is to have unwavering focus. You see, where focus goes, energy flows. Meaning if you are focused on your vision, and it's most likely a high conscious vision, this idea of you living in high consciousness that brings about whatever it is you want. So maybe it's more money, or maybe it's a certain relationship, whatever it is that you're unfolding next. If you give more faith to that, you visualize that, you keep in your mind that, you hook into that more than whatever your current reality is, then that will start to come about more and more. Essentially what you're doing is you're rooting yourself in high consciousness. And so it's to give more faith to the vision, the full quote, than the physical realm. So to give more faith to the vision than your physical circumstances. And when you focus more on your vision, that a lot of times, and again, this might sound a little woo-woo to some of you, but a lot of times is something that's being given to you from your higher self so you can move into that next version of you. When you give more faith to that and you make that more real than your physical begins to change. And again, I've seen it happen with too many of our students, too many people I've worked with to know this isn't the case for every single one of them that went through and did the work. This is exactly what started to happen. The vision they had at the beginning crystallized into their physical and magical stuff just started happening. And the thing is, it's not really magical. It only looks magical because most people don't know how this works, but it's actually just a very natural outpicturing, a very natural flow of universal principles. It's all natural. We just aren't aware of these things because we weren't taught these things, so it looks like magic when these things come in out of nowhere, where these things come in and you're like, how did that get in here? Well, it's just because you know the nonlinear way in which life works, and we've given you what you need to hook into that. So it looks like magic, but it's really just the natural effect of natural principles when you actually move in adherence to them. So have more faith in the vision than the physical circumstances, and that magic will start coming into your life. And number 7 is to learn and discern between when it's your head or your heart speaking. Again, this is where we need to bring in honesty, because so many people, again, I talk to so many people, and it doesn't break my heart because I've gotten used to having more boundaries around this, but it would always kind of in the past break my heart when I would talk to someone. And you know, one of the things I love to say is to follow your heart, to take leaps of faith into the unknown. And I would be talking to people and they'd be telling me how they're doing that, and I'd be like excited to learn more and be like, oh, that's amazing. So how has that manifested for you? How has that happened? And then they'll describe certain things to me and I'll be like, this isn't their heart at all. This is their head actually keeping them small, because then they'll start justifying why they can't do the thing that's in their heart. They don't know it's the thing in their heart, but you can sense when you have a sense for this that it clearly is. And a lot of people will use that as an excuse, what their head is telling them not to follow the heart. And so one of the most valuable tools, one of the most valuable abilities that you can develop is learning the difference between your head and what it wants and what it's trying to do, which is where your ego is, where your survival mechanism is, that doesn't want you to leave your comfort zone, and your heart, which is always focused on expansion, of you experiencing more of what you actually are, is focused on actually raising your consciousness. You want to really develop the ability to discern the difference between the two. Because I can't tell you how many times people have had an opportunity that I've spoken to make a decision that would change their life, but because it's uncomfortable, because it requires something that they absolutely could do, but they've never done that before, so they don't do it. And they justify it by saying, oh, my heart just says no to doing it, ha ha ha. But it's not their heart. It's definitely a fear-based pattern that's coming from their head. And again, be honest with yourself. You know, it might feel better in the moment to take yourself away from the pressure of moving outside your comfort zone, but it's a short-term kind of relief that's going to lead to long-term kind of pain and suffering if you keep doing it, right? So learn the difference between your head speaking and your heart. It's not that hard to understand. The heart is connected to truth. The heart will be a feeling-based thing, not fear, by the way. Understand that things like anxiety and fear are not feelings. These are thoughts. These are things in the mind that are trying to convince you otherwise, right? Your heart, as far as feeling, will be yes or no, and it will not justify. If your heart, for example, is saying something to you, and then it comes with all this justification afterwards, guess what? It's not your heart usually, it's your head, right? But if your heart tells you yes to something, and then your head tries to justify that it's not, that thing it said yes to was the thing it wants, because the heart isn't concerned with justification. The truth doesn't justify. The truth has no need to justify, to defend, to prove anything, or to conquer, because the truth just is, right? It is only the head and force that needs to justify in order to convince, right? And so understand the difference between the two. Again, something that with people I work with, I go so deep into because it's so crucial, then they can go out and make decisions based on that, and it always leads to amazing things in their life, because they're like, oh, my heart's telling me this is clearly my head, so now the choice is, do I want to follow my heart or my head? And they're clear on what that is. It's so crucial, and especially when it comes to raising your consciousness, you have to follow the heart. The heart will lead you to the higher levels of consciousness. It will lead you to being courageous, to moving up the scale and living a beautiful life. The head will just lead you to the illusion of safety, not actual safety. There is no safer place to be in actuality based on universal law than your heart. But your head will lead you back into the comfort zone and what is quote unquote safe. And so the last one I want to give you is, please develop that discernment. Again, if you are really ready and committed truly without from the heart to actually do this, then I would go check out the EMF training I left down below. But like I said, I will also leave you some more training. Now again, I don't want this channel to be about more information. I want it to be about transformation. But if you want to learn more about the subconscious mind, you can go check out this video there where I deep dive into this. I hope this has been helpful for you so far, and I will see you in the next video, hopefully over there.